The Jewish nation has arrived at the sea, the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds. The miracle occurs, the sea splits, they cross the sea, the Egyptians are drowned. What happened in the aftermath of this great miracle? So there are two things that happened. One thing that happened is that the Jewish nation, when they saw the entire Egyptian army that pursued them strewn on the river bank, on the sea bank, they took advantage of that situation and they removed the jewelry that these soldiers were wearing, what they thought would be their final conquest of the Jewish people. Moses, on the other hand, the Torah says, was guarding the remains of Joseph. And our sages tell us that what Moses did was the right thing. Not only was it the right thing, but it was a sign of his wisdom. Chacham leiv yikach mitzvos. The wise-hearted takes mitzvahs. In other words, the simple understanding of this midrash is that the Jewish people were interested in the spoils. Not a very complimentary thing to say about the people who were just liberated and were on their way to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. Moses, on the other hand, was wise. He knew what was important. Guarding Joseph's remains was his mitzvah. Question is asked. The Jewish people were also engaged in a mitzvah. Because if you remember, when the Jews were ready to leave, God says to Moses, tell them to ask their Egyptian neighbors for their gold, their silver, their clothing. Why would God want them to ask the Egyptians for this? So the Talmud tells us that God says, I don't want the patriarchs to complain to me. I promise them that their children will be slaves, Abraham particularly, that their children will be slaves in a foreign land and will be oppressed and persecuted, but afterwards they will leave with great wealth. Please ask them to take the spoils, the wealth of Egypt with them, because people might say, let me get out of this slavery first. I don't care about the wealth. In order to dispel that possible response and reaction, please tell them that I want them to take the spoils of Egypt. And there are deeper Hasidic interpretations that the spoils of Egypt contain with them the divine sparks, and by taking the spoils, they were taking these sparks of holiness with them. So it was a spiritual thing, not just a physical thing. So why was Moses praised that he was doing mitzvahs and he had to pull the people away from the Red Sea, the banks of the Red Sea, in order to continue their trip towards Mount Sinai? They were also doing a mitzvah. So what makes his mitzvah more important than their mitzvah? Well, there's a simple answer, but it has a very profound message that is particularly relevant in these days. In general, life is not so simple. Invariably, people will go through life and be exposed to situations where there are conflicts between one mitzvah and another. We have enough conflicts between doing right and doing wrong, but sometimes it's a nicer kind of conflict that we are involved in a certain mitzvah and another mitzvah comes to our attention. Which mitzvah takes precedence? How do I assign our priorities? So there are general rules about this. One rule is that if I'm engaged in a mitzvah, I'm helping someone, and another person comes along and needs my help, no, I don't have to interrupt. I shouldn't interrupt. Ha'esek b'mitzvah, parta min ha'mitzvah. The Talmud establishes a principle of law. If you're engaged in a mitzvah, you're exempted from another mitzvah. The Talmud discusses, and it's recorded in the Code of Jewish Law, people who are communal activists, who are involved in helping the community, while they're in the service of the community, they're exempted from prayer. So you see that you can have two conflicting obligations, and there's a principle that tells you which obligation takes precedence over which. The one that you're engaged in takes precedence. Another example, if you're studying Torah and someone comes to you for help, And the only way you can help them is by interrupting your study of Torah. And we know that Torah study is the most important of all the mitzvahs. It would make sense to say that you should not interrupt. Well, it's not so clear. It depends on the situation. If someone else could do the mitzvah of helping that person who is not studying Torah, then you shouldn't interrupt your Torah study, but rather continue learning and let the other person handle whatever emergency had arisen. If, on the other hand, no one else could do it, you're the only one around who could help, you're obligated to interrupt your Torah study to help that person. Okay, but now the question is, what happens if you were not engaged in one mitzvah, and the question is, should you interrupt it to do the other mitzvah? Two mitzvahs come your way. You didn't start doing either one, and you have to decide which mitzvah to engage in, A or B. How do you determine which mitzvah? So I'm not going to go into all the possibilities, but there's one very clear possibility that the Talmud Jewish law establishes. If one mitzvah involves personal gain or pleasure, and the other mitzvah does not, the other mitzvah requires breaking your nature, getting yourself to do something that you don't enjoy, that you don't benefit from, is not profitable in any way, that mitzvah takes precedence. Why? Because when you do a mitzvah that you don't want to do, you have no interest in doing, you are suppressing your yetzer hara, your evil impulse. And what does that accomplish? So the Zohar states, and this is a Zohar that's quoted in a famous discourse of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, who issued this discourse for the 10th of Shvat, which turned out to be the day of his passing, and is studied by Hasidim every year. And one of the principles that he establishes at great length and great depth is based on a quote from the Zohar. Kadiskafya sitra achra, istalek yikara de kuchabrichu b'chulu almin. When you suppress the other side, that's a Kabbalistic terminology for evil. When you suppress evil, when you suppress the negative forces in this world, you cause the elicitation of the most transcendent aspects of God to be revealed in this world of ours. If you do a mitzvah that you enjoy doing, that you have no pressure against doing, then that mitzvah is incredibly powerful. It elicits great spiritual energy, but it's not comparable to when you do something that suppresses your own interests, your own pleasure, your own nature. Because just like you broke your own nature, so too God breaks, as it were, his nature. That means that whatever spiritual energy is part of the natural order of the world, conventional spirituality, God says, I'm going to suppress that. I'm going to introduce into the world a transcendent energy. And little by little, with that transcendent energy, you create an imbalance. Instead of the imbalance being more evil in this world, more darkness in this world, the imbalance becomes a positive imbalance. There's more light in this world, to the point where the light overwhelms the world, to the point that evil disappears, which is what Mashiach is all about, the Messianic age is all about, where evil will ultimately be totally vanquished. Now we can understand the difference between Moses and the Jews. Both were engaged in mitzvahs. We cannot say that the people at the Red Sea bank who were stripping the Egyptian soldiers from their ornaments and jewelry, they were fulfilling God's command that they should take the wealth of Egypt with them. Not just the wealth that was in Egypt, but the wealth that the Egyptians brought with them. And there was a spiritual reason for that as well, to remove the sparks of holiness. That's all great and wonderful, but it can't compare to Moses, who was doing a mitzvah that did not bring him anything, any positive pleasure or profit, just guarding the remains of Joseph. That took Moses' wisdom to realize that that mitzvah is greater than the other mitzvahs and takes precedence over them. This explains a problem that seems to be associated with the Messianic age. It says in the Mishnah that in the Messianic age, we will still remember the Exodus from Egypt. And the question is why? the exodus from Egypt pales in comparison to the redemption of the world, the Jewish people, and the whole world that will take place with the coming of Mashiach. So why should we mention a minor miracle? It's like a person who wins the lottery of $1 billion and also made $1 on the side. Are you going to talk about that dollar when you're talking about $1 billion? And Hasidic thought answers that yes, there's an advantage to the exodus from Egypt even over the Messianic age. The advantage is that at that time the people had to engage in suppressing their negativity. They had to struggle with their nature. That's something that we won't have in the Messianic age. So we might be missing that advantage. So God promises us that even in the Messianic age, there will be times that he will allow us to experience the suppression of the negative side, which is something that we experienced at the Exodus, that we will also have that sporadically, I guess, in the Messianic age. May we soon, imminently experience the Messianic age when we will have both qualities, the quality of iskafia, of suppressing the evil, and the quality of ishapcha, the transformation of evil into positive energy.